Imagine a world where the very foundations of one's faith are uprooted by a series of questions, each more challenging than the last. This is not a hypothetical scenario. It is the reality that has faced Christian scholars, especially in the early 20th century and beyond, as they grappled with critical approaches to the Bible. What was once a harmonious relationship between faith and critical scholarship has, over time, transformed into a complex and often contentious dialogue. This video explores the journey of biblical criticism, from its initial acceptance by Christian scholars to the radical shifts that have occurred in recent decades, and the emergence of new approaches that seek to reconcile the two. By the early 1900s, many Christian scholars had come to accept critical conclusions about the Bible that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. The Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, was no longer seen as a seamless work by Moses, but as a composite text shaped over centuries. The New Testament, too, was subject to scrutiny, with scholars like Mark and Q being identified as the primary sources for the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the Gospel of John being recognized as a later, more theologically developed work. The idea that not all of Paul's letters were genuinely written by him also gained traction. Despite these critical insights, many scholars managed to maintain their faith, often by embracing the concept of progressive revelation, the idea that God gradually revealed his truths to humanity through a historical process. The quest for the historical Jesus, a critical attempt to understand Jesus as a figure in history rather than a theological construct, became a significant area of study. Albert Schweitzer, a prominent figure in this quest, argued that Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet who expected the imminent end of the world. This view challenged the more liberal interpretations of Jesus as a teacher of peace and love. Over time, other scholars proposed different portraits of Jesus, ranging from a wisdom teacher to a revolutionary leader. These diverse interpretations, while critical in nature, often coexisted with a commitment to the Christian faith, demonstrating that critical scholarship and religious belief could, in many cases, be compatible. However, this delicate balance began to shift in the latter half of the 20th century. In Old Testament studies, a radical turn to the left saw scholars reassessing the dating of the Pentateuch. The traditional view, which placed the J source, the Yahwist, in the pre-exilic period, was challenged by theories that placed it, along with the P source, the priestly code, in the post-exilic era. This meant that the stories of Moses and the early Israelites, as presented in the Pentateuch, were seen as later constructions, not historical accounts. This shift in perspective was part of a broader trend that questioned the historical reliability of much of the Hebrew Bible, with some scholars even suggesting that significant portions were written in the Hellenistic period, long after the events they purported to describe. New Testament studies, while not as radical, also saw significant changes. The Gospel of John, once viewed with skepticism, was increasingly seen as containing historical material. This view, however, has since been challenged, and current scholarship tends to be more cautious about using John as a source for the historical Jesus. The study of Pauline letters has also evolved, with a greater emphasis on Paul's context and the ways in which his message was shaped by his environment. Rather than seeing him as the primary founder of Christianity, these developments have led to a more nuanced understanding of the New Testament. But they have also raised questions about the traditional narratives of Christian history. In response to these critical approaches, some scholars have sought to reassert the Bible's authority and relevance. One such approach is the canonical approach, championed by Brevard S. Childs, which emphasizes the Bible as it exists in its final form, rather than delving into its historical development. This approach argues that the text we have is the one that has been canonized by the Church and Synagogue, and it is this text that should be the focus of interpretation. Similarly, the theological interpretation of Scripture seeks to understand the Bible as a coherent whole that provides the framework for Christian faith, rather than as a collection of disparate texts. These approaches appeal to many Christians who feel that critical scholarship has fragmented the Bible and stripped it of its spiritual significance. Another strand of final form interpretation is more literary in nature, focusing on the aesthetic and narrative qualities of the biblical text. Scholars like Robert Alter and Frank Kermode have highlighted the literary excellence of the Bible, drawing parallels with modern literature and emphasizing the text's artistic and rhetorical features. This approach, while not necessarily religious, has helped to reframe the Bible as a work of literature that can be appreciated on its own terms, regardless of its historical origins. In conclusion, the relationship between critical scholarship and Christian faith has evolved significantly over the past century. While the initial acceptance of critical insights allowed many scholars to maintain their faith, the more radical developments of recent decades have challenged this balance. Yet, new approaches that focus on the Bible's final form, whether from a theological or literary perspective, offer a way to bridge the gap between critical scholarship and religious belief. The journey of biblical criticism continues, and with it, the ongoing quest to understand the Bible's place in the modern world.